Well, good afternoon if you are in New York City or in Cleveland, Ohio. Good evening if you are somewhere in Western Europe. Special love, as always, to our loved ones in Ukraine. We are with you. We stand with you. Greetings to people all around the world. Regular visitors know that I'm Fred Plotkin. This is Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to music lovers all around the world. Today's particular program had an unusual genesis because back in January of 2023, I had wanted to do a program about the composer Nino Rota, who was the composer of many great film scores. He won an Academy Award for The Godfather Part 2, but he composed more than 150 film scores, most famously his collaborations with Federico Fellini. And January 20th was the birthday of Fellini, and I thought that would be a nice time to do this. I worked with Fellini. I knew Fellini. I met Nino Rota once, and I started trying to find the right person, and the right person was not available at that time. But I decided he's still very interesting. His name is James Feddeck. I have never met him before our conversation today. And as you will discover, James, who was born in New York and grew up here where I'm from, joins us now from Cleveland, Ohio, but spends a great deal of time in Milan, happened to be conducting music by Nino Rota. And I got in touch with him and I said, I would like you to come on and talk about yourself and get to know you, but also let's devote time to Nino Rota. So James Feddeck, welcome to the program. Why are you in Cleveland?
Thank you. Well, I live in airplanes, but I also have a place to live here. So it's nice to have some free time, so to speak, if there ever is such a thing as free time. But
why Cleveland?
As you said, well, I used to work for the Cleveland Orchestra as one of their conductors, and I haven't actually moved since, and it's a lovely place to be. And usually I'm free in the summers more than during the concert season, as it were. So the summers are, of course, very beautiful here.
Well, let's talk about the Cleveland Orchestra, because traditionally, historically, there was always the reference to the big five of American orchestras, and I'll try to do it alphabetically: Boston, Chicago, Cleveland, New York, Philadelphia. And that's not a ranking, because very opinionated people tend to rank them differently all the time. There are people who now say that the Los Angeles Philharmonic, the San Francisco Symphony, the Dallas Philharmonic, a number of the Nashville Symphony in Washington under John Andrea Nozeda. There are now other orchestras, the Atlanta Symphony, that are wonderful. We have many wonderful orchestras in the United States, but the historic big five are the ones I mentioned: Boston, Chicago, Cleveland, New York, and Philadelphia. The New York Philharmonic, which is my hometown band, is the oldest orchestra in America. It was founded in 1842, the same year as the Vienna Philharmonic. Right now, I don't make listings, but right now a lot of people who know this stuff say that the best of the big five happens to be the Cleveland Orchestra. And it was the last of the five that I heard in its own home. I only got to Cleveland for the first time in 2015 and went to an absolutely stupendous concert by the Cleveland Orchestra. It was Mahler I'm suddenly forgetting the name of the beautiful hall.
Severance Hall.
Severance Hall.
Severance.
Talk right. About this absolutely gorgeous building that had stupendous acoustics. And then yourself as a conductor who works in that environment.
I think hands down. Well, of course, I haven't worked for the Cleveland Orchestra now for 10 years. I have been guest conducting all over the place, all over the world. But I think Severance Hall, or Severance Music Center, as it's now called, is one of the greatest concert halls in North America, perhaps even in the world. And it's an orchestra always is shaped by its hall, the sound, the quality, and I think that is maybe part of the Cleveland Orchestra's secret formula in a way, is that hall, having that hall to play in every day. And it's a remarkably beautiful looking place and beautiful sounding place. And the orchestra is truly one of the great orchestras today. I think probably has always been regarded very, very highly, the Big Five, as you say, and so forth. Although I'm not sure what the Big Five, how we necessarily came up with that, except maybe in that period, those were the big cities. Those were
Well, they were the
big,
big cities. I mean, Cincinnati has a very old orchestra. I think it's actually older than the Cleveland Orchestra. And Cincinnati has a wonderful music hall. And I've mentioned Cincinnati, it's the same state, it's Ohio. And in the past, Cleveland was the biggest city, Cincinnati second, Columbus third. Now Columbus is the biggest city.
the biggest, yeah.
Yeah. But historically, those other two cities have great musical traditions. Ohio in general, even in smaller cities like Dayton and Toledo, have remarkable music traditions that not every American state can brag. I think it's in part a lot of German heritage in the state, a fair amount of Italian heritage, but the fact that Ohio had a lot of industry, Northern Ohio, oil and all kinds of heavy manufacturing at a time when orchestras and museums and cultural institutions were supported by industry. In the case of Cincinnati, there was Procter and Gamble, which is a soap company, ostensibly, but they believe that if you support the arts in Cincinnati, you will attract better employees to come there to work at Procter and Gamble. So it's a very particular strategy. I must say that when I went to Cleveland, it was in November. It was very snowy already and cold. And there was a football game between Cleveland and Pittsburgh, which is a big rivalry. And the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was there. And I went to that and I liked it a lot more than I thought I would. There's a market in the western part of town, a wonderful old food hall that was
That's
just
right.
dazzling in terms of its offering, because it was not touristic, but it was actually about food, and there were dairies, and it's a remarkably evolved cultural city. Wonderful art museum that I went to, and that was my only visit to Cleveland, but it really made me want to go back there, and it made me understand more why a city that, let's say, is less famous internationally than Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, could punch its weight with the other four artistically. The orchestra, right now, the music director is Franz Welser-Most. In the past, they've had George Zell. They've had really wonderful conductors. James Levine began his career there, even though he was from Cincinnati. And so the legacy is there. The audiences, I believe, are there. I know that they perform in the summer at something called the Blossom Music Festival. And historically, in the winters, we'd go to Miami, like a lot of Ohioans, and perform in Miami in the winter and do a residency there. I know that Franz Welser-Most, who loves opera, has attracted a lot of wonderful performers to come and sing opera in concert in Cleveland, because Cleveland does not, it has an opera company, but no one thinks to go to Cleveland for opera. They go to Cincinnati for opera, Chicago, New York, and Detroit, and so forth, but not Cleveland. But nonetheless, the occasions where Franz Welser-Most has brought opera singers to to Cleveland, has tended to be outstanding. And after they perform in Cleveland, they come to New York and do the same program at Carnegie Hall. So
Yes.
I imagine that you have created deep musical roots in that community. I ask because, I mean, I know many Americans and people who are not Americans who set up homes in places that are not immediately expected, and they're very happy there in those homes, when perhaps flights from Atlanta or New York or Dallas or Washington would be easier to get to Europe, because you spend a great deal of your time conducting in Europe and just logistically. So I guess I want to know a little more about your life in Cleveland as a Clevelander who happens to
Well,
be an important international conductor.
Cleveland, as you say, is really kind of a fantastic place culturally. And it's, for whatever reason, not the place that these days comes up in people's minds necessarily. But from a historical standpoint, especially for art and music and culture in the United States, it does have a place in the tradition when you really get into the history of what has happened in Cleveland. And I used to love spending time when I worked for the Cleveland Orchestra. As I said, 10 years ago, I started guest conducting really all around the world and left that position. But I used to love spending time in the library and to see, especially the George Zell archive of all of his parts and scores and letters. And I mean, there would be letters between Zell and Stravinsky and all the visits Bartok would make. Of course, these were people who came to the United States. But also the great guest artists that over the years, just Cleveland was always part of that circuit for the great artists who would come to perform in New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Boston, and so on. It was, and actually, if you look at the map, it's kind of a circle in a way that makes complete sense. And I still see today an enormous love for the arts here, which compels me and encourages me in lots of ways. I mean, what the Cleveland Orchestra has done for example, in the last few years, I mean, anyone under, I have to remember, I guess it must be 18, can go for free to the concerts. They have the program completely endowed. And for people who are in university or college, and not just music students, but any student has an enormous discount. I think it's $30 or $35 for the season to go as many concerts as they would like to, provided the tickets are available, which they usually are. I mean, it's a big concert hall that is regularly packed. And it's amazing. The people here love the arts, love the orchestra. The art museum is tremendous. As
It's
you mentioned.
magnificent, that art museum.
It is absolutely, and the permanent collection is very impressive. But also, I mean, the exhibits that they get from all other museums around the world to contribute for the the temporary exhibits and so on. It's just a fascinating place with great people. And usually when I say to people, oh, I'm coming from Cleveland, my flight's going to Milan or going to Berlin or London or so on to conduct, I'm coming from Cleveland. Sometimes I have to explain where that is. I usually say, well, it's kind of between New York and Chicago, smaller city. But people say, why do you live there? Why would you want to live there? And they ask it in a very generous way. And I am a New Yorker. I love New York. I love to go. I still have family in New York, and I'll always be in New York in my heart. But the truth is, I mean, I can't remember if it was the last time I conducted Chicago or one of the times I conducted the Chicago Symphony, to go from the orchestra hall, downtown Chicago, to O'Hare Airport to catch my flight back to Europe where I had to work next. It took 5 hours by car because of traffic. It's supposed to take, I don't know, 40 minutes, 35, 40, maybe 50 minutes, certainly not really more than an hour. It took 5 hours. I missed the flight. I'm on the phone in the car trying to, I mean, in that span of time, I could have flown from Cleveland to Chicago or New York or Washington, D.C. and made my connecting flight. So in lots
you're
of
a maestro, but when I'm in Chicago, I went to school in Chicago for a while at Northwestern and spent a great deal of time in the first opera company I worked at was actually the Lyric Opera of Chicago. You're a maestro, but when I go to the airport in Chicago, I take the subway, the underground. Because
Well,
it actually
the
is
orchestra,
unlike New
I
York.
probably should have gotten out and done that. But the orchestra was very kind to arrange a car and so on. So I was in the back seat,
Yeah,
and the doors were locked, and we were crawling along. And of course,
yeah.
you don't think that it's going to take that time. You think, well, this is just a little patch and so on. But I've enjoyed my time here, and I really enjoyed my time with the orchestra, Cleveland Orchestra, to to learn to be a conductor. It's really not something that can be taught, but of course it is taught like everything. I would say the best system is probably still like the apprentice, the old apprentice system. And that's really what I had, to be the assistant associate conductor of the Cleveland Orchestra, to be with Franz Welser-Most, to be with all the guest conductors. I was listening, and to be with that orchestra. I was listening to that orchestra every day, except Mondays, because Monday is the free day, every day for 50 weeks, every year for 4 years. And not only that, but I was also responsible at that time. I think it's different now from what I hear, but at that time I had to produce the radio broadcasts. And it was everything that the Cleveland Orchestra did had the attention to detail I have never seen in any of my work conducting other orchestras. And now that list is probably close to 200 other orchestras I've conducted as a guest. I've never seen another orchestra.
200?
So I have to go back and look, 180 something. I don't know.
Wow.
It's been a while since I looked, Fred. You're keeping me honest. But as a guest, I've never encountered another orchestra that is so committed to detail, that is so about doing things in a committed and doing things in the right way. We could discuss what is the right way, but there's an understanding that it is about artistic excellence on every single level. So when I was producing these radio broadcasts, which would go out internationally, they expected CD quality. I mean, they really expected fully engineered, edited. It's not to say that this isn't the actual concert that happened, but of the 4 performances in a week, how do you choose the best one? How do you combine and best represent not only the orchestra, but what the guest conductor and the artists are also trying to portray? So, and I took it enormously seriously. But the point I guess I'm trying to say is, in this kind of mentorship of learning to become a conductor, whether that's, for some people, it has been through the opera houses. For me, it happened to be through this very intensive period working with one of the world's greatest orchestras, to have my ears cleaned by listening to them every day, listening to the recordings, to have that go out at the best possible quality and level and so on. I was totally transformed just by the orchestra, just by surrounding myself with the sound of the orchestra, and their level of precision, and also the guest artists. And that was true with Welser-Most. That was true with the recording projects we did with Boulez at the end of his life. That was true with when Blomstedt would come and all the people. There was always something to learn. And also, you talk about opera and Welser-Most bringing opera. It's a little known fact, but the stage that we had at Severance Hall there, it actually had a proper opera pit that could fit a Wagner-sized opera. And so when I was there in Cleveland, Welser-Most was doing the Da Ponte operas of Mozart, and they were fully staged. He brought the productions from, at that time, it was just before he was appointed the general music director in Vienna. So he was still attached, as it were, to Zurich Opera. He would bring the entire production. The sets would come over from Zurich. The cast would come from Zurich. And I remember it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I got a phone call from the driver of the orchestra, because the orchestra has a driver for this and that and the guest artists and so on. And she said, he's not feeling well today. I thought, okay, that's interesting. And about 10 minutes thereafter, I got the official call. Velsomost is sick. You're going to conduct tonight. And there I was doing Don Giovanni fully staged with the Zurich cast, and it was sold out. And it wasn't the premiere, but it was the second performance. A premiere. I mean, the Cleveland opening.
Yeah, first night.
And there it was, and actually I had a number of those kinds of step-in things, as well as my own performances and concerts planned with the orchestra. So it was not just hearing them; it was working with them. And I was 25 years old when I was appointed to that position. I say appointed, but it actually was an audition, where I think at first they had 25 people they were looking at from around the world. And then they narrowed it down to 4, and we all came to Cleveland and had a proper audition. So I felt incredibly honored to be selected through such a competitive process. But at the same time, what business did I have at 25 conducting one of the world's greatest orchestras? The learning curve was huge for me. And it's not to say I wasn't prepared or ready, or you do your best. But it just totally opened up my mind.
I want to take it back a little further. You studied at the Oberlin Conservatory, and for Americans in the arts, Oberlin has a very specific connotation, I think. I've been to a lot of Ohio. I've not been to Oberlin. And talk about Oberlin, talk about its role in the American art scene. And, it's always, there are a lot of jokes about OBs, but they are made lovingly, that the people there are sort of like the hippies of the opera world and the classical music world. And it's not sort of Curtis in Philadelphia, or Juilliard in New York, or Peabody, and it's Oberlin. It's a different thing.
Well, Fred, I think you hit the nail on the head. I'm not sure how to describe it any better. For those who don't know, Oberlin is a conservatory of music. I think it's the oldest conservatory of music officially in the United States. But it is also with Oberlin College, which is a liberal arts college. And they are completely on the same campus in a very small town in rural Ohio in the middle of nowhere. I mean, if you walk out of town, you find a cornfield. And it's beautiful. It's amazing. So I came to Oberlin by way of my wonderful teacher, my organ teacher growing up, whose name was Robert Owen, who was the Oberlin Conservatory class of 1949.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, you've got to check out Oberlin. And long story short, I don't come from a musical family. I mean, Fred, when it was birthdays, I was holding my ears because everybody was singing happy birthday in a different key, in a different rhythm. And it was absolutely miserable. I was the only one who noticed. I mean, totally non-musical, but they loved music. They loved music. Mm-hmm. And we had a piano in the house because my grandfather, who couldn't graduate high school because of the Depression, he had to work as one of the oldest children. He had to work in order to support the family of, large New York kind of immigrant family of a lot of kids and so on. So he couldn't even finish high school. So as a present to each of his sons, my grandfather that is, he gave, as a wedding present, he gave a piano, a grand piano. Uh-huh. So we had a grand piano in the house, but it was nothing but a desk for picture frames. And one day I went up and I started to play it by ear as a young child. So I always say music found me. And in truth, my dear mother, who now has passed away, she loved music so much. She always wanted to play the piano. But it was the kind of thing where it was either we take piano lessons, or for her growing up, either she takes piano lessons or there's lunch money for her and her sisters in school. So there were no piano lessons.
Mhm.
And she tried it as an adult, but as we all know, as we get older, it gets harder to do
Yep.
new things for the first time.
Mhm.
But she always loved music, always wanted a musical child. And she tried with my brother, and he gave it a try. But then all of a sudden, there I was, and music found me. So I was playing the piano, taking piano lessons. I loved the sound of the oboe. I was an oboist playing in
Mhm.
orchestras, and I was working in church music as an organist. I've got this organ here at home behind me.
Mhm.
You can see it. I still try to play because I find a conductor gets really weird if they stop playing an instrument. We get too much in our own heads because we live such studied, solitary, idealistic lives without
Mhm.
attachment to practicalities. Um, and so when it came time to go to conservatory, I knew it would be music. Fred, I'm getting to Oberlin here. I know you asked me about Oberlin. When we got time for applying to conservatories, I didn't know what the heck to do. I was a pianist. I was an oboist. I was an organist. I was playing chamber music on everything, loved everything, working with voices and choirs and accompanying everybody I possibly could find, instruments, singers. The thought never occurred to me that I'd have to choose something.
Mhm.
The thought never occurred to me that one has to specialize. I just did what I loved. And I loved music, and I loved all these things about music. And so when I applied for conservatories, I applied in everything.
Mhm.
And really, for the most part, I got an in to the conservatories on everything.
Mhm.
And so that didn't help. And there was one very famous school, I'm not going to say where it is. They said I couldn't apply in more than two things because they only had space in the computer for two things. So that kind of tells you what the mindset of a lot of places was. And then phone calls to the house to my parents. Well, he really can't be able to audition and all these things because how can somebody do that? But no one ever told me I couldn't. So I just did it.
Mhm.
And when you don't know any better, you do it. Well, Oberlin was the only place that said to me, come here and we'll figure it out together. And that, Fred, that is a very Oberlin thing.
Yes.
That is come here, we're going to figure it out together. And I came to Oberlin, and I was a pianist. I was an oboist. I played in the conservatory orchestra. I was an organist. They have a fantastic organ department. The collection of instruments, I mean, they have millions and millions of dollars worth of organs. They have about 5 concert organs and 20 practice organs. It's absolutely tremendous for an organist. You can cross the street and be in Paris 1 minute, style organ, to North Germany across the street, to an
Mhm.
Italian organ over here, to a mean tone temperament instrument over there. I mean, just phenomenal. And then the day came when the dean called me in and said, okay, well, you're going to be in school for like 12 years here. And I thought, we can't afford that. So I started to conduct. I couldn't make a decision. I had one teacher, she said this was actually at Tanglewood, because I was one summer a pianist at Tanglewood. For those maybe who don't know, it's the very great summer music festival.
Of the Boston Symphony.
Boston Symphony.
Yeah.
And so I was actually a pianist there. And I remember I was studying with a great teacher. And she said to me, she was from Argentina. And as someone from that kind of background said to me, she said, you've got too many lovers. You're going to have to get married. So what are you going to get married to? And for me, that was conducting.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I only am a conductor because of Oberlin, because Oberlin is in the middle of nowhere. And everybody was so hyper-focused on what they were doing and otherwise, was living there in the middle of nowhere in this small town. So I started to ask people to play for me. I said, play for me, and let's do all the Brahms symphonies. Let's do Tchaikovsky next. And they would say, okay, what do you want to do next? And we were doing one thing after another. We would rehearse it in a day or two and perform it the next. And the school, Oberlin, they would give me the concert hall. They would give me the orchestra parts. They would, I mean, again, this is a very Oberlin thing.
Mhm.
I can't imagine that happening in many places. So,
Leipzig.
yeah, it
That
was
would be about it.
incredible. Yeah, it was incredible. It was
Yeah.
incredible. So I ended up a conductor because I loved the music, the repertoire. I would look and see every composer would try to write for orchestra. That was always the pinnacle of their work, and to spend a life doing that, it's never enough. And but also
James,
I
let
love
me
the
say
people.
something. I want to say something parenthetically to our listeners because people listen to us all around the world. And you and I are speaking as two New Yorkers talking about a part of the United States. Um, Obviously, the East Coast of the United States received immigration first, and many of the oldest orchestras, musical institutions happened in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, and so forth. But when other kinds of immigration came and the United States began to expand west and south, especially west, um, these great land grant universities in the middle of the United States, such as Illinois, Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, a lot of them created enormous music schools and cultural schools. And historically, 10 of these universities were called the Big Ten. Now the Big Ten has expanded to include Maryland and Penn State and Nebraska and lots of places. But the big ones were basically Ohio State University, the University of Michigan, Michigan State University, Indiana University, University of Illinois, Northwestern, University of Wisconsin, University of Minnesota, and I believe Iowa. And all of them, and Purdue in Indiana, and all of them except Purdue had these enormous musical faculties, so that the one that's the most famous is Indiana University, IU, the Jacobs School in Bloomington, Indiana. And Indiana historically is a conservative state politically, and yet Dr. Kinsey, I believe is the name, the famous sex researcher, was at Indiana University. And this amazing music school was there. I happened to go for a while at Northwestern in Chicago, and then the University of Wisconsin, even though I'm a New Yorker. And Wisconsin has its study abroad program in Italy through Indiana University. And most Americans who go to Italy tend to wind up in Rome or Florence and Venice and don't speak Italian. I, through Indiana University's music school, wound up at the University of Bologna, which has it's the oldest university in the world and has the first multi-purpose performing arts faculty in Italy. It's called DAMS, Dipartimento di Arte, Musica e Spettacolo. And if I had gone to Yale or many of the big Eastern schools, I would never have wound up there. But Indiana, in the middle of the country, was able to be the conduit to that. So when people from elsewhere think of the United States, I really want them to think not only of our city of New York, but a remarkable cultural landscape. Texas, which politically and culturally and so on is different from a lot of other places, really funds the arts in a
Yeah.
massive way, in a remarkable way. Throughout the country, you see that in California, of course, but really, even in small towns, there are musical traditions, I mean, classical for the moment. Needless to say, much of the United States, including the American South, but also Michigan, are big states for popular music, New York, obviously. And this minestrone of music, as I call it, this combination of all these different musical influences, plus the fact that we have people who are of African descent, of Caribbean descent, of Irish, Scottish descent, of those musical traditions, Eastern European, Italian, French, English, everything, Latin America, Spanish-speaking world, all of that converges in the United States. I didn't even mention New Orleans, which is a remarkable musical city, in Charleston, throughout wherever you go in the country. And St. Louis, the blues, Kansas City, the blues. great historic symphonies there, an opera festival, very good in St. Louis. When you and I are throwing these names back and forth, we do it in a sort of shorthand because it's our business. But I think it's really important to understand that, yes, you can say that Oberlin is in a cornfield, but it is a remarkably famous institution. I've not been there, that has produced incredible musicians for a very long time who have huge influence internationally on opera and classical music.
For sure.
So I
For
just
sure.
wanted to say that because listeners who are sitting, in Australia or South Africa or Peru may hear us talking about this, and it sounds like something very local. It's not. It's
No.
very international in a cornfield.
If you look at the list of alumni from Oberlin Conservatory, of course, you could even broaden that and look at Oberlin College, and it becomes the writers and the incredible figures. But if you look even just at music, the list is astonishing of conductors, pianists, singers, many of the leading people today. And we all have that sort of thing in common, which was a place that we could study, experiment, grow our minds and find our way and be encouraged to find our way. The other thing that, Fred, it's amazing to me as I mostly now work a lot in Europe, it surprises people who are not from the United States when they think about and really see that all of this is privately funded.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't understand the sentiment that very often accompanies, well, in America, culture is not an asset as much as it is in such and such place. I don't understand that, because all of these places, in big cities, in small cities, in seemingly unusual places, they are all fully, completely funded and exist privately. So many people have to be devoted to this to make it happen, to keep it going. And that really encourages me, because I am not a pessimist at all about the future of classical music. And usually people say, well, come on, you're kind of a young looking guy. You really think it's going to be around? What's it going to look like? I don't have any doubt. I absolutely don't have any doubt. It will be here. It is here to stay. And just look across the world at all the places where it's thriving and funded and supported privately, publicly. There are people who can't live without this. And as long as we have that, and as long as we keep people making music, experiencing music, and I'm a big believer as well in amateur music making. I'm a professional musician. I am so fortunate and grateful. I make my living by being a performer for people and bringing people together from all walks of life in that way. But I am a big supporter for amateur music making, whether that's singing in a choir or learning to play an instrument, and that is what keeps people connected to music, is having it in their life as something to experience. And I'm all for technology. I think it's great. I mean, the availability of things now, that to listen to any recording you want, and I mean, it's unbelievable. It's incredible. But still, people have the desire to come together with others and share a cultural experience in a concert hall, in a setting outside of their home, and people can't live without that. And so a lot of people, they've said to me, oh, come on, with this pandemic and so on, isn't it depressing? Everything closed down. Look how fast it went away. To which I say, look how fast it's come back. Mm-hmm. Look how fast people, I mean, in Milan, where I have my orchestra, and I was, by the way, traveling all through the pandemic. I think there was only maybe about a month, 2 months that I didn't travel internationally. And maybe people don't know this because everything I read says the young American James Feddeck. But I also have a European documents and so on. So I was able to travel internationally without a problem, and travel to Milan and come to my orchestra and go to other places as well. And we did concerts because in Italy, of course, as many people would know, things were forced closed.
Yes, very
So,
specifically Lombardy, Milan, James, because we're just speaking
absolutely.
now, you don't really know this, but I worked in Milan. I lived in Milan for a very long time. It's a city I know incredibly well. I've been there constantly in all my years since going to school in Italy. And Milan has changed remarkably. My first visit was 1973. So we're talking 50 years ago. I was a teenager. And it has changed. It's had good periods and bad periods and so on. I think right now Milan is in a very good period, culturally and technologically and so on. Not perfect, but it's doing well. But Milan and Lombardy were the epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic in Italy, and it hit there before it hit New York and the United States. It was after China, it was then Northern Italy was the
Yes.
first place out. And I have friends who are from Lombardy but live in New York who happened to be home when that happened, and they were stuck in Milan for many months, or in their little town in Mantua or Bergamo, wherever they lived, or the provinces, and were not allowed to cross the street to
No.
go talk to them. It was that severe a lockdown, much more than New York. And so it interests me to know that you were actually traveling, because many people from Lombardy were not.
Yes. Well, for the first months, of course, everything in Italy was forced closed. I mean, I don't think people could leave their homes for just about any reason without papers in
Mhm.
hand saying, I'm going to the grocery store or I'm going to the doctor. But there did come a time, definitely by September of 2020, that things were allowed to be open for work. So what we did with my orchestras in Milan at the Teatro del Verme, the Orchestra I Pomeriggi Musicali, and what we did was, even though people couldn't come to the concerts for a little while, things were closed down again, but people were allowed to work. So the musicians would come to the theater, we would have the concerts because they were working, and we would have the
Mhm.
concerts at the regular time. Actually, we didn't change the programming at all. I think maybe we had people that couldn't travel, couldn't come, or, of course, people got sick too. So we maybe had to change here and there, but we did not change our programming. And we gave our concerts Thursday at 8, Saturday at 5, and it went out for free on the internet to anybody who wanted to watch, including and especially our subscribers. And we did that every single week from September 2020 on until things could fully reopen without any change.
Mhm.
I actually don't know any other orchestra that did that. People tried to do things, then it got too difficult, or, let's change our programming and so on. But see, this orchestra, my orchestra, it has a fascinating history in Italy. After
Which I
World War
wanted to
II,
talk to you about. Yeah.
now I don't mean to lead you on here, Fred, steal your
No,
thunder.
I was going in that
Uh,
direction anyway, so we're together.
uh, and actually, it's the thing about this orchestra that I found most attractive and why I agreed to be their chief conductor. It's a very important place in Italian musical life, the Orchestra I Pomeriggi Musicale.
Which
And
means afternoons of musical afternoons.
the,
Yeah.
the Musical Afternoons Orchestra. And there's a reason for that name, because after World War II, everything was destroyed. La Scala obviously was not able to perform, and so on. The culture was devastated. And a group of musicians said, we need culture. We need the arts, we need music, and we need to come together. And so they started this orchestra, literally and truly out of rubble, out of the ruins. And the orchestra has played ever since. And as I understand, sort of out of respect to La Scala and the others, they would give concerts in the afternoon. So that as the others came back, that hence the name, the afternoon orchestra. As other orchestras would, and cultural institutions and opera came back, of course, opera is really central in Italian musical life. So for La Scala, just down the street from our theater, out of respect for that, the orchestra, Pomergi Musicali, would give concerts in the afternoon so that they would not conflict with La Scala. And people would come in the afternoon here and go to La Scala at night when the time came that everything was fully restored after the war. Now,
May
of course,
11th,
we do.
1946
Yeah.
was the opening of La Scala. Yeah.
And now, of course, we do play concerts at night too. The tradition is that we have now is Thursday night. But out of this tradition, the Saturday concert is always at 5 o'clock. And people, actually, in many ways, I think it's more often than not the more popular time. Saturday at 5 o'clock. And I think that's a really neat, tradition. And so
what
as
I've
time,
always liked about that, because we're only meeting today, but I've been going to this orchestra for years. You get to go out to dinner after the concert.
yeah, it's so great. It's so
And that
great.
feels so cultured in Milan to, after your beautiful afternoon of culture, to go and then have your risotto or whatever it is you're going to have and be able to talk about music into the evening after the concert.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Or go to something else. I mean, there's so much going on in Milan. You can go somewhere else. So historically then, this orchestra, Orchestra Pomergi Musicali, became, and I don't know if it was intentional or it's just what happened, it became sort of the gateway for other artists in the world, other European artists, and also from the United States and elsewhere. It became kind of the gateway place for artists to first make their debut in Italy and very often in Europe. They first came to this orchestra, and then from there, they would go to the others in subsequent seasons after having that sort of entree. And I think Bernstein, one of the first European orchestras he went to, Stravinsky regularly came there, Hindemith, Honegger came. It's such an interesting history. And so today, one of the things that we do and was so interesting to me as well, that idea continues. And of course, we have also very established people. As much as I kind of hate that word, I don't know what established means, but that's often how it's described, very established people. But we also, and it is a priority for me to give opportunity to people who are also so talented, but starting out. And especially for Italian musicians who are starting out, because, you know, the prophet is not always welcome in the hometown. And that's true. It's very interesting. You look at French orchestras, they very often they are not bringing French people. Certainly in the United States, you look at the conductors and a lot of the guest artists, for the most part, they are European born. I'm not sure why. Maybe people think it's better to have something not from their backyard.
I'm a big lover of Hector Berlioz, and he was really rejected in France for the most part.
Completely.
Yeah.
But you know, that's not unfortunately not an isolated example. So what about an Italian orchestra that gives opportunity to young Italian musicians and others too? I love that, and I embrace that, and I work very hard for that, because I think that is what we also have to do for the future of our art, is to create opportunity for the talent so it can develop. You know, I often hear, especially these days, you think, well, who's going to be the next chief conductor of such and such famous place? And well, there isn't really anybody. nobody really good enough, and so on.
No, that's not
But
true.
but you look, the thing is, look at what's been going on there usually before. It takes time to foster relationships. It takes time for artists to develop. And in order for artists to develop and musicians to develop, performers, they have to have opportunity. If you don't give people opportunity, what's going to happen in 20 years to those people? You won't know who they are. So I in my work and what I try to do with our orchestra and elsewhere, I always try to propose to give opportunity, because that is 100% what we need for the future. And then the conversation won't be, well, who do we have? Or there's a vacuum of talent of such. There is no vacuum of talent. We have more quality coming out of every conservatory in the world now than we ever have before. We have more originality of thought in the musical compositional life than we've ever had before. Why? Because we have such globalism. We have such exchange of ideas. We have the internet. We have, I mean, this incredible, Fred, you asked me to send some recordings. I mean, I could spend in this Adagio platform.
Catalog, yeah.
I could spend a year and forget, I would die of hunger and thirst because I would forget to eat anything. It is so fascinating. You have everything possible. Yeah. So that only means that the level grows.
So let me just pitch in a couple of things here, because first I do want to say that people who are not familiar with Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio may not know that Adagio is this rather magnificent music streaming service that people can subscribe to. And I asked my guests to select from the catalog things that inspire them. And we will attach James Feddeck's selections to the show page on which he will appear. And they include Bruckner and Mendelssohn and Richard Strauss and Samuel Barber and Brahms, and a composer I don't know. It's an organ work played, I think, by Robert Owen, who was your teacher. But the other thing I want to say is that people who are not familiar with the Italian landscape in terms of orchestras may not know that most theaters, because let's not forget Italy became a country in the 1860s, therefore resident orchestras and their theaters belong to the town. So that Ferrara and Modena and Mantova, these noble cities, all had their own orchestras and their own theaters. Bigger cities such as Bologna, obviously Florence, Rome is a special case, Genova, Naples, a magnificent musical tradition in Naples, Bari, Palermo with a great conservatory, Catania, in Sardinia, in Sassari, and in Cagliari, Torino, remarkable. So all of these places, Venice, needless to say, Trieste, all of these had their own orchestras that were attached to their theaters. And the theater would present everything. So it would present opera, ballet, classical music, concerts, chamber music, vocal concerts in repertory. But the orchestra belonged to the theater. There are in Italy a few national orchestras, or ones that are not part of historic theaters, because the Teatro del Verme opened in 1872, but your orchestra did not come there until the 1940s when it was constituted. But there are the RAI, which is the National Broadcasting Service, used to have several RAI orchestras. Now it's all concentrated in Torino, not Rome. Rome has, in addition to the Teatro dell'Opera di Roma, the Rome Opera, it has the Accademia di Santa Cecilia, magnificent institution where Antonio Pappano conducts. And there are orchestras in certain cities that are constituted outside the historic opera house of the city. But the access to music is different in Italy, I think. Until the arrival of Silvio Berlusconi, who owned networks in addition to running the RAI, because the government runs the RAI, you had music on the RAI all the time. When I was a kid in Italy and a young man listening to music, I knew which programs to tune into to get an opera from La Scala on one night, an opera from Catania on another night, classical music performance, the Spoleto Festival. Radio 3, the third channel on the radio, always had opera and classical music with very intelligent commentators. 3 years ago on this program, I had the guest Enrico Stinchelli, who's based in Rome, and he is called a music critic, but he's also someone who's directed opera and focuses on how to listen to opera and classical music and what style is. And there are millions of Italians who through broadcasting follow this stuff. Berlusconi destroyed certain traditions, I'm afraid, because I lived before the pandemic, also lived in a little town in Liguria. And every Friday we would have a program. And on Saturday morning, when the fishermen were going out to sea under my window, they'd be whistling the music that they heard on the radio the night before. With Berlusconi, unfortunately, that disappeared. But it is so deeply entrenched. But Italians, I believe, don't necessarily, they know of their heritage, but they're not immersed in their heritage the way in other countries, Austria, for example, you might find it a lot more. Spain, even, you find it a lot more than Italy. But I say that as a digression because whether it's visual arts, whether it's fantastic food, whether it's all kinds of things, Italy is so blessed that they don't necessarily valorizzare, which is the Italian verb for give the credit and value that it's due. Is that your experience, at least regarding music?
I will say that I love to work in Italy for this reason. And I love also to work with the young people in our audiences. We have a number of programs with young people and so on. The questions that there was one school group that that I met with, I think the young people, they were maybe 10 years old, 10, 12 years old. The questions were unbelievable. I mean, they were so advanced about their understanding of what they were hearing and seeing and engaging with. And, you know, that may be okay. You could say the education system and so on, but it's greater than that. It's everything that you're speaking to, Fred. It's in their blood and culture is such a part of their life and such a part of their surroundings everywhere they go. I think they underestimate it. It's not fair to say take it for granted because they don't, but it's just such a part of, it's like running water. You know, it's just something that, of course, we have it. What's amazing to me is in my personal experience, I have rarely, and I've conducted a fair bit around Italy now, and not just, of course, where I'm principal conductor, but the Rai Orchestra, the National Orchestra, and various other places too. There is such a love and recognition of quality. And that's not to say that that doesn't exist in other places, because it does, it can. But there is such a, I don't know how to describe it, and you're going to have to help me because I think you have much more experience with the sensibility than I do, Fred. But there is just such a recognition and appreciation for things of quality in culture and the arts, which is still truly remarkable. And they do apologize in a way. I mean, I was speaking to someone in Milan, older gentleman in his 70s, and he was saying, oh, it's not like it used to be, and so on. And I said, well, it may not be like it used to be, but it's still pretty darn good.
It is, but I think I understand what he means because I'm 66, and so therefore I'm almost near my 70s. But I knew Italy and I knew Milan when I met many people who remembered World War I, and many, many more who remembered World War II and referred to it as La Guerra. When you said La Guerra, unless you were in the Northeast where it was World War I was La Guerra, the rest of the country La Guerra was World War II, and you didn't have to explain. And people had memories of bombed out buildings. In Bologna, but not only, also in the South, remember buildings that had bullet marks on it from the Second World War. In the main piazza of Bologna, you could see the bullet marks in the piazza. And all over Catania, near the Opera House in Catania, the wonderful Teatro Bellini in Sicily, you could see bullet marks, you could see the rubble. And Italians sought to rebuild from that, but they rebuilt in such a way that they wanted to join the Western nations again, to put fascism behind them, though they've not successfully done that completely. And they wanted to rebuild their economy. And the so-called boom economico was a miracle in Italy, because it went from being a country in rubble to being one of the wealthiest, most successful, technologically advanced countries in the world, with help from the United States and other countries. But the Italians really did it themselves. And I think they did it in two ways, despite having 70 governments. One was that when you read the Italian Constitution, the first line of the Constitution is something that I subscribe to completely. Italy is a nation built upon work. And the concept that work is in the very first line of the Italian Constitution, whereas the American one is about rights, about freedom, about dignity. In Italy, it was about work. And the stereotype of Italians of being lazy and carefree, Italians are incredibly hard workers.
No.
Because how could they have built that nation 2,000, 3,000 years ago? And then the Renaissance and all the glories that you see there, that's work and that's patience. And they have that. But also the Italians, I think, a little bit overuse the word passione, passion. But what they mean is it's a passion about quality. And a few, I would say a year ago or so, I had as my guest Riccardo Illy, who is of the Illy coffee family in Trieste. And he was the mayor of Trieste and on the board of the Opera House there, and then governor of the region of Friuli, Venezia Giulia. And he'd published a book about the Italian passion for quality, and that it's not about producing mass quantities of things, but producing things of beauty and value. One of my heroes is Vitruvius, the ancient architect, who, and let's see if I can remember the three words, were firmitas, utilitas, venustas. In other words, firmitas, long-lasting, durable, utilitas, useful, practical, venustas, beautiful. And when you look at a building in Italy or a shirt in Italy that is designed to be beautiful, durable, and useful, when you look at the store windows in Italy, it's done with this passion for quality and beauty and so on. The Italian touch, this Italian desire for excellence, underlies all of that. And despite the political issues and despite a lot of problems and a lot of negativity the Italians, I think, feed to themselves, unfortunately, I keep telling my Italian friends, you need to understand, almost the whole world loves you and wants to be you. So you must be doing something right, even if, the Italians always find reasons to complain that things are not as good as they should be. In some ways, they're not, but in many, many ways, they are. And I think it goes back to the sense of work, of not doing something in a shoddy way that it gets done quickly, but it's of mediocre value. It has to be lasting. It has to have meaning. Agriculture, the rhythms of agriculture that feed into the cuisine, the slow food, the approach to everything being savored, whether it's music or food or the aesthetic or a conversation. To me, one of the greatest things in Italy is the sociability that happens. Yes. When you go into a food store, you always have a little conversation before you get down to buying your liver or whatever you're buying. And it's expected that you do this. And in other countries, either it's very cold, give me a pound of liver, or just very flat, or there's not care about the quality of the liver and how it's butchered. And I'm talking about liver not because I love it, I don't, but just because even something as controversial as liver is taken very seriously there. And they would say, well, do you want pork liver, calf's liver, chicken livers? How will you be cooking it? This whole conversation comes out that it's just not about the exchange of a product, but there's a context for everything. There's a meaning for everything. And if people don't know Italy the way you and I know Italy and love Italy, they just see it as a beautiful place with great clothing and gelato and sexy people and all that. But it's so deep and so complex. And, I'm glad that you are living there, and I will one day go back and live there, certainly. And it leads me in a way to the way you and I connected, because we've never sat together before, is that I was looking to do a program about Nino Rota, a wonderful Italian composer, really a stupendous Italian composer. And the more I study him, the more I admire him, who is a little bit forgotten, I think. And he shouldn't be. And when I was doing research back for January of 2023 for Fellini's birthday, I found that James Feddeck was conducting Nino Rota. And that's why I contacted you. So start by talking about what, when, where with Nino Rota and what he means to you. And then I'll talk about what he means to me.
So in November and in January, November of 2022 and January 2023, we had performances of Nino Rota's Napoli Millionaria.
Okay.
Wonderful opera.
Yeah.
Which surprisingly, and maybe actually not surprisingly, has not had much of a life. Only, I think we were the fourth or maybe fifth set of performances that it's ever had in terms of the production since 1977, when it was premiered at the Spoleto Festival.
Mm-hmm.
And it's never been performed.
Where I saw it.
Did you see it? Were you there?
I met Nino Rota, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
I've got a lot of questions. Questions for you. But I don't think it's ever been performed outside of Italy.
I don't know.
Not
but,
once.
The background is, there is a great Neapolitan school of theater, often in Neapolitan dialect. The De Filippi family, or De Filippo, I always forget, Eduardo and all the others. And then there was an actor called Totò and an actress called Tina Pica, and then later Sophia Loren, and all of these people came out of Naples and acted in this. And there was a film version that starred Sophia Loren. And there was a version done in English in London with Lady Olivier, Joan Plowright, which didn't quite work because it was too garlicky, if you know what I mean. It did not capture the subtlety. It was just painted with a very broad brush. But Neapolitan humor and cadences and speech is very, very particular, wonderful. But I don't think it translates to the non-Italians. And I think that even Italians elsewhere only get a glimpse of what the Neapolitan means. It's kind of like Brooklynites in New York, and once you get a little past Brooklyn, you don't know what they're talking about. It's the same thing.
Well, it's true for this opera. A lot of it is in the Neapolitan dialect,
mm-hmm.
And a lot of it has references which are in the story absolutely local to Neapolitan culture. I mean, down to the coffee pot.
Yep.
This was a learning experience for me. Of course, you can't think of Italy and not think of coffee. Everything happens around the coffee, but it's not like going to a cafe in Vienna. You don't stay there very long, as you know. Mm-hmm. You're there, but and down it goes, the espresso or whatever, and off you go. But I mean, negotiations happen around that.
Yeah.
That's where the business happens. And so, but in Naples, of course, Fred, I'm sure you know this, but this was a revelation to me and probably to a lot of others. There's a special coffee pot.
La Caffettiera Napoletana.
Where it's got two parts, the bottom and the top is the inverse of the bottom. So there's two spouts, one this way, one this way. And you fill the bottom with water, and then very carefully, after it's hot from the stove, you flip it.
Yep.
And you just pray you don't spill it all over the place. And then the water drips through the coffee in the center, and
Right.
there you go.
Yeah.
And I mean, even down to
Which
that
is
kind of,
therefore, to people want to know, I have a master's in coffee. So the other is known as the mocha, and that was invented by Bialetti in the north. And that's where you put in the water and it goes down, but there's no flipping and turning, and there's this gurgling sound, and then you open. It's very charming.
that's
But
right.
the
Now I have to
cafetiere
say,
napoletana.
Fred, I never drank coffee ever in my life. I hated it. I hated the smell,
Oh.
but until I went to Italy. It's serious business, as you know. And in
Yeah.
your honor, it's a little cold now because I've been waiting for this
I
moment.
have my own.
I've got my espresso here. It's a little bit cold, but I'm going to stir it. It's a little cold, but we can't have a meeting about this, you and me, unless we're doing it the right way. So
I make my own and I put it in a jar.
here's to you, Fred. Here's to you.
Thank you. No, but therefore, someone could see La Cafetiera Napoletana on the stage for Napoli Milionaria, whether the play, the film, or the opera. And that's a symbol, that's a context, like putting a pizza would be, in a way that things are unmistakably Neapolitan.
Yeah, right.
But Naples is so particular because, apart from being, after Venice, the great historic musical city of Italy, even before Milan came later. But Naples really was the successor to Venice, and the Teatro San Carlo had three young composers, Bellini, Donizetti, and Rossini, all working there at the same time. Rossini was sort of the music master, and all the great singers came to Naples. And the historic tradition of Naples, the conservatory in Naples, is remarkable. But within that context was also the speech, the cadences of Neapolitan speech that led to Neapolitan popular song. More than any other city in Italy, Naples is the city that has its own popular song. It's like New Orleans has jazz to a certain degree. Paris has the chanson, Berlin has cabaret, but not to the degree that Naples has the musica napoletana, which is really something extraordinary, which Nino Rota took the cadences of and put into his music. I just want to say briefly about him. He was born in Milan. His talent was revealed very early. He wrote 150 film scores, 10 operas, 5 ballets, orchestral music, chamber music, choral music, theater productions for Zeffirelli, for Visconti, for Edoardo de Filippo. But although he was from the north, he spent a great deal of time in the south, specifically Bari, in the Liceo Musicale di Bari, which was the sort of music conservatory. And he taught there from 1950 to 1978, despite all the composition he did, and despite being a northerner, and despite spending a lot of time in Rome at Cinecittà. He was, I think, the greatest Italian film composer. One of his students in the Liceo Musicale di Bari was Riccardo Muti. And Riccardo Muti then went to Naples and claimed that as part of his patrimonio, and then, went on to the career he did. But Riccardo Muti is very proudly a man of the South when it comes to music, Southern Italy, and has been also a great advocate for Nino Rota because of his studying with Nino Rota. But I think the fact that certain vocabulary, and the word I hate most is incidental, that someone would write incidental music for Fellini or Visconti or Rossellini or any of the great film directors. We're saving Fellini because that was a particular relationship. But therefore, when you did Napoli Milionaria, you were bringing the hometown boy, which is to say Nino Rota, who was Milanese, and his music back to Milan. Do the people of Milan have an awareness of Nino Rota? They know Giuseppe Verdi, who was not Milanese. They know of all the great conductors who have come out of Milan through the, all the years, up to now with Gianandrea Nozeda, but also Gavazzini was actually from Bergamo. But many of them, all the Abbado family were Milanese. Milan is a remarkable tradition, but it's not necessarily known for its composers, many of whom came to the Milan Conservatory: Cilea, Puccini, Verdi, and many more. Mozart came to Milan in the 1770s and did 3 operas in Milan before establishing himself back in Austria.
Yeah.
But Nino Rota is really, for me, par excellence, the Milanese composer who made good, but is forgotten.
I think everybody knows, especially in Italy, everybody knows who Nino Rota is. Everybody understands his greatness as a composer, but predominantly, mostly, only as a film composer. I think that is unfortunate. Unfortunate in the sense of being slightly inaccurate. Because when I first got the score, I mean, the story goes, we do opera productions, the Pomergi Musicali Orchestra, we do opera productions as well, throughout actually all of the regions. So these performances were in Pavia, Como, Bergamo, Cremona, in these months, November, January. So we were all over the place. Orchestra goes, the cast, the set, everything is moving around. And so we were going to be doing, I was going to be conducting a production, but what would the opera be? And when this was proposed, I loved the idea. And I was surprised that there was some reservation. I was surprised, but I'm not, because as I say, the hometown, you know, the maybe Rota is thought of in different ways in different places. Although, as I say, this opera was never even performed outside of Italy, and hardly performed in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
So I love the idea. I got the score, and in studying it and also listening to the premiere, which I now learned today, you were at that one of those performances at least.
I was 21.
It's incredible music.
Mm-hmm.
It is an understatement to say that Nino Rota was, as it's often said in this way, just a film composer. No. Now, first of all, what's wrong with being the greatest film composer that has ever, you know, what is wrong with that as a statement? That is not just anything, but he wasn't just that. I mean, here, this was written to, what year did he die? 79. 79.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is the end of his life, as it turned out. 77, Spoleto Festival. Here we go with the opera, and it's amazing music. It is so well crafted. And I have to tell you, Fred, in all of the performances, the reception that we have had is over the top. People say, what happened that we don't have this as part of the repertoire? And that's not just a few people. I mean, over the top, from Pavia to Como to Bergamo to Cremona, every night, the sentiment is, this is unbelievable. And I have to say, and one of the things I would love to ask you is, since you were there, I watched a video of the, I don't know if it was the premiere itself, but it was certainly the first production. The audience is very polite, but they're not really, when it's over, I mean, they don't seem that into it. Was that how it was there?
Remember, so I was 21. I did not have the opera knowledge I do now. I guess I was studying in Bologna, but I was still a student at that time. And I had never been to Spoleto, to the festival. I've been many times since. This being a festival founded by Menotti in Umbria, and a very special place unto itself that has gone through many transformations. But at that time, I actually went for a play. I didn't go for this. I went for a play by Lina Wertmuller, the film director, but also attended this opera. and I knew of Nino Rota's music from the movies, from Fellini specifically, but I didn't know anything else by Nino Rota at the time. I since have come to learn a lot of his music. So I cannot evaluate the response 40 years on, but I can say that I liked it because I found it very warm and rollicking and emotional and funny. And again, my Italian was not what it is now, and my Neapolitan is non-existent, and because it's such an impenetrable dialect, but it has the spirit of Naples. And I knew
Yeah.
Naples by then very well and loved Naples. And that's what I got from it, is I felt that I was being transported back to the Neapolitans who are improvisational, l'arte di arrangiarsi. In other words, you wake up every day and you try to figure out how to live through that day in the world. That's Naples. So many things are not a given in Naples that you have to be very spontaneous, very creative, very artful in the way you get through your day. We were talking about coffee, and there's something in Naples that I think is a wonderful institution, that when you go to Naples in a coffee bar, if you have a little extra money, you pay for a second one, not for yourself, but for the person who will come in who cannot afford it. And that kind of caffeinated solidarity it's very Neapolitan, because a lot of people in Naples don't have 2 lira to rub together, or €2 now. Even now, it's a city of great wealth and great poverty. And statistically has great achievement, but also some of the highest levels of illness and crime and everything we think of. But that's part of the fascination, is that it can all live together. And so what was captured for me in that opera was the Neapolitan spirit that I love. I'm a New Yorker, you are too, but I think I grew up in the neighborhoods that we had a lot of Neapolitan Americans and Sicilian Americans, and that spirit was here too, of you make what you can, si da da fare, you do what you can. And it's a wonderfully improvisational thing that infiltrated New York decades ago. We see it less here now. New York has become more homogenized like the rest of the country, but it used to have that. So my memory was, I think that the audience who went to the Spoleto Festival combined Americans and foreigners and people who just would not have gotten this opera, plus fancy people from Rome, Florence, and Milan, and Torino, who did not want to demonstrate their affection for something that was so bawdy and broad and Neapolitan. I think that may be the response that you detected.
But I have to say that was not the response at all with our production.
When you performed it, yeah.
And now I think this opera would be a tremendous hit just about anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
The music is fabulous. I think the story is so incredible and universal. I mean, you have
the basic story.
Okay, so of course, as in every opera, how deep do you want to get? When you get down to it,
Right.
There's all this other.
Remind me, I should know this. Is the lead character Filomena? Is that her name?
The lead character is Amalia.
Amalia, right?
Amalia. So it's World War One. World War II, and there's all the problems in Naples, the food rationing, and as we talked about coffee and so on, you can't have a day without coffee. You can't, the culture, deals are made out of coffee.
Mm-hmm.
Sins are forgiven over a coffee. Come on, I'll buy you a coffee. That's just the culture. I mean, you get into an argument with somebody, the argument continues until the guilty party says, okay, I'll buy you. I think that's actually Italian life. That's universal Italian life.
And the word actually is offro io. I will offer the coffee.
That's right.
Offro io.
I know I'm in trouble when I hear that from a musician in my orchestra. So it's all about how this family is involved in corruption in order to survive. And like all Italian families, the life of the family is centered around Amalia, centered around the mother. it's just, that's how it is. The mother wears the pants. No, I mean,
The
that's
expression is la mamma es siempre la mamma.
sempre la mamma.
Mother is,
Exactly.
she's always the mother.
And so she's there smuggling the stuff, the coffee, the tobacco, all the good stuff, the stuff nobody can get and everybody wants. And she's working the deals to the point where in the opera's in 3 acts. The end of the first act, her husband, Gennaro, is lying down on the bed, pretending to be dead. The family is dressed as nuns, praying, Dies ira, Dies ira. They have the rosaries out, Madonna, Santa Maria, la, la, la. Big charade for the police coming in, because of course, under the bed are all the goods in the closet, and they, anywhere they could stuff it is all this stuff they shouldn't have, that they're selling and smuggling. So the police, of course, at the end of the first act, they understand what's going on, and the dead man rises from the dead. He comes up from the bed, just pretending, of course, only to be interrupted by an air raid siren, and everybody scatters. That's the first act. The second act, the war is over, and full extravagance is on display. American soldiers are there. They've brought out everything that anybody could want, and there's all excesses imaginable. It's the good life, better than it ever had. But what's interesting in the story is you see the continued degradation of the family. You see the continuation of what corruption will look like now in light of excesses. The mother now is having an affair with Enrico. The daughter, who is sort of the Maria Rosaria, represents the good town girl, everybody's daughter. She represents the everybody's daughter of Naples, just the model person. Well, she gets pregnant by an American soldier who says, I'm leaving tomorrow, Johnny. I'm leaving tomorrow. I have my own family back home. And he pulls, in the end of the second act, a beautiful aria and duet between the two of them. He pulls a wad of money out of his pocket and throws it at her and says, here, that's for you and the child. I have to go home. I mean, it's unbelievable. And then in the third act, Gennaro comes back from war, and he's psychologically just a mess, disaster. And he's just a step away from a nervous breakdown. The daughter is pregnant. The mother all the swindling is catching up to her, and all the things she's doing with Enrico, running around here and there with this affair to hide it. And basically what you have is the complete, and I'm not going to destroy the end. I don't want to give it away. But it's not it's not a happy ending in a certain sense, because it all just falls apart. From the corruption of having nothing to having everything and having a wonderful life, but having the total dissolution of the family and the psychology, it's unbelievable. It's an unbelievable story. It's perfect for today. I have to say, it would be so captivating to anybody today, despite the Neapolitan coffee pots and the certain, I mean, in the opera pit, the Buca, when we were playing, musicians were laughing at these phrases because they were so Neapolitan. Yep. People, as the performances are going on, they're laughing because, okay, even with that part of it removed, the story is so compelling. And then you have the music. You have such Neapolitan themes. You have Rota's pulling from different cinematic themes that he's used over the years. And I even heard a little bit of The Godfather there, I have to say. But then you have, with the American soldiers and so on, you have boogie woogie, jazz, big band, all the music at the time coming together until finally in the third act, where I say all the psychology is happening and falling apart, the musical styles are changing so rapidly. You have the Neapolitan to something jazz, to it's in a certain way continuing the story of what's happening on the stage. Only a musical genius could write that.
And I should add that Nino Rota knew America because, and when I met him, we spoke in English because he was proud of his English, because Arturo Toscanini, who was anti-fascist and was living mostly in New York, brought Nino Rota to America and introduced him in Philadelphia to the Curtis Institute, where Nino Rota studied composition and performance. And although he had already composed by the age of 11 works that continue to have validity to this day in oratorio and so on, and early operas and fables based on Hans Christian Andersen, it was Toscanini who said, let's get you out of fascist Italy and let's get you to the USA. And so that was very influential for Nino Rota. And he picked up the jazz rhythms, and he heard Gershwin, who was alive then, and he heard all of this music of the early 1930s in the United States. And then
you never heard anybody write better than that,
right.
That style. I mean,
right.
it's what he's done in this opera, taking all of these idioms. I mean, it's unbelievable. And what's so interesting and ironic to me, Fred, is that, you talk about those, I think it was 2 years he was in Philadelphia, Rota. He had to be studying and became friends with Samuel Barber, Menotti, Copland, all of the list of great, from that period, great American composers who, I am sorry to say, I don't know why, they kind of have the same fate. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times I proposed, let's do a work of Aaron Copland or Samuel Barber, or one of the pieces in this list that I proposed to you, this Barber First Symphony. I propose that all the time to orchestras. And still to this day, people say to me, Samuel Barber, oh, I don't know, he's not such a serious composer. I've had that said. And I can't believe that. I mean, Samuel Barber
composed the opera that opened the Metropolitan Opera House, the new Met.
It's crazy. And so the idea that Nino Rota is just a film composer, it's so missing the point. It's so, that's not actually the case.
People categorize. I mean, Aaron Copland was sort of an openly gay Jewish man from Brooklyn. He was not in-your-face gay. There's nothing obviously wrong with being gay, but what I mean is he just lived his life. But to some people, that was antithetical, whereas Menotti and Samuel Barber were a couple for quite a while. Right. And Menotti, born in Italy, but really very Americanized. And I think that Aaron Copland is known for sort of Western music, cowboy music, Salon Mexico, very American flavored music that is somehow reduced in the judgment of people, although things like his Third Symphony is very complex. And therefore, Stans and Leonard Bernstein championed Aaron Copland. I think Copland was a relaxed, genteel, gregarious fellow and didn't strike people as, serious musician, whatever that means. He was very inclined to mentor younger musicians and was an all-around apparently very good guy, but somehow that stripped away the reputation for the quality of his music. But even Bernstein said that it was really Copland who was the father of American classical music. You could go back to Ives and further, but I see the point about Aaron Copland being an iconic American composer. And frankly, in Europe, that's looked at as being inferior in a lot of places. It shouldn't be, but it is. Yeah. And Barber is seen as, English language primarily, and Menotti as being a composer of well-crafted operas, but not, quote, serious opera, whatever that means. Although Amal and the Night Visitors is one of the great Christmas operas, and Amelia Goes to the Ball, and all of these. The Medium is a masterpiece. Have you ever done The Medium?
I never have, but I know it. It's a masterpiece.
That might be a very interesting thing for your theater and orchestra, now that I think about it.
I'll propose it.
That would be a very interesting piece, because you could build around Menotti and so on. But anyway, I'm not saying it was an anti-gay thing, because Nino Rota was not gay as far as I know, but it was just that they were all part of this group who also, frankly, were liberals. And then fascism was in Italy, and then the war and the Second War. And I think they just sort of got lost in the shuffle, except for Nino Rota, who
Yes.
kept composing in Italy, and he composed at such a pace. That's, to me, was so phenomenal.
Yeah.
150 film scores, 10 operas, 5 ballets, and all kinds of orchestral music of every, I mean, a trombone concerto, I think, just everything.
It's a good
And
piece, trombone concerto.
yeah,
It's one of the best ones for
yeah.
trombone. Yeah.
My dad was a trombonist, and I learned it from my father. And but now let's talk about Fellini. I will say, in full disclosure, Federico Fellini is far and away my favorite film director. I've taught courses on him. I was honored to know him and his wife, Giulietta Messina. And that's how I came again to know Nino Rota somewhat, until he died rather prematurely of thrombosis in Rome on April 10th of 1979. He was 67. But Fellini said, and not just me, but in books and interviews all the time, that his most important film collaborator was not the cameraman, not the actors and actresses, it was Nino Rota. And that Fellini didn't necessarily write script. He would do disegni, he would do drawings of his imaginings, or part cartoons, and he would, create the face of a figure and then have an improvisational line that was the way in. And somehow Nino Rota was on Fellini's wavelength to understand what Fellini was after dramatically or comically, and he would compose the music that Fellini would then take and put in the film and then direct to the music that Nino Rota had already composed. The most famous example of this is La Strada, 1953-54, in which the character is Gelsomina, played by Giulietta Messina, this very sad figure. And there's this very mournful trumpet solo that even after Gelsomina has died, the people of this poor town remember the music. So the music by Nino Rota becomes an echo of the character. And in every single film, whether it's La Dolce Vita, which is my favorite film, 8½, which is all about memory and this collage of who we are and what we're meant to be, Rota did not compose the same kind of music as he did for the film before, but composed music specific to the characters and the dramatic situations. And yes, there are other famous directors like Steven Spielberg and John Williams who collaborate over time, and they inspire one another. But I don't think there's any case in film history in which the composer inspired the director so much that the director would change his film based on the music that was composed.
And that's, I mean, Fred, you're far more an expert in this than I am, but that is my understanding of something so remarkable to have that partnership. I mean, that, think about it, the composer would, the inspiration of the composer would force the director to change the direction of the film. That's a creative giant. That Nino Rota, I mean, that, come on, that's who can do that? Not
and now
one of a
that I think
kind.
of it, I never thought of this before. So much of Rota's music in Fellini films is like opera music, in that if you listen to the great Verdi operas, just to take one of my heroes, what you hear in a Verdi opera is not just the words that Violetta or Manrico or Otello is singing, but what music Verdi composed. It's an emotional carpet underneath, and it may comment, or it may, if a character says, like Simone Boccanegra, I will change, or I have changed, the music that Verdi wrote under that expresses, number one, how he's changing, two, that his life is ebbing away from him. All of that happens. And Nino Rota, and I didn't think of this really till now, provides that degree of complex musical commentary on the situations, but also on the language. Because in Fellini, yes, there's language, but it's so much more the situations, the way a camera would pull back and reveal a character on a windy beach, and standing there, and the camera would pull back and pull back and pull back. And we may feel ourselves removed from that character who stands there unmoved, but then Nino Ralta's music will make us feel compassion for that character, feel pity, feel a sense of doom, whatever we feel or the music makes us feel. It doesn't command us to feel one thing. It gives us more material to emotionally engage with these films, so that, I mentioned the characters on the beach because in Fellini, a lot of people wind up ultimately alone and abandoned, and often it's on a beach or in a field, all by themselves. And it's incredibly emotionally beautiful what Rota did, on top of the achievement of Fellini. And I think that Fellini was great in acknowledging that his films were made infinitely better by having Nino Rota there with him as he created the films, composing the music, rather than adding a soundtrack after the film is cut.
Yeah, that's what I think people would not fully embrace when they say the statement, he was just a film composer. Because it's not a soundtrack thing. It really, as you say, Fred, it's the partnerships that Rota had also for Napoli Milionario with De Filippo, the partnerships, the way he understood and inspired drama. This was not a one-way street. This was not just coming from the director to the background music. I mean, in every way with Rota, it's not just in the film music, but I think the operatic work song, even the trombone concerto was an unbelievable piece. And not everybody would love the trombone, by the way, with all due respect to your father, but it's an incredible character in that piece. It's unbelievable.
My Neapolitan gesture.
Yeah, watch it, Fred, watch it. But just such a genius. I mean, I really personally love the fact that a New Yorker had to present or present again to their own people, Rota, to Italians, and say, come on, look at this. It's unbelievable. And the response was overwhelming for this. And I just hope I hope for two things, Fred, about our performances that we've had in this whole production. I hope that it, first of all, can help give Rota the prominence and the recognition as an artistic figure, composer, but also just for everything that he's contributed to this musical drama landscape. I hope it can restore him to a rightful place in a way. And I hope that this opera is going to have legs and get a performance outside of Italy, because people, as you know, because you were there for the first one, people would love this music.
Yeah.
And people would just be so into the story, and I think also find a lot of the cultural references. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there about Naples and so on, but it's such a fascinating glimpse into a very particular, enthralling time in history from my standpoint. I hope it gets legs and gets a performance outside of it.
So, Giacomo, we've never met. We have found a lot to talk about. I have to say arrivederci until the next time. This has been a wonderful conversation. I'm glad to have gotten to know you, and I'm glad that my listeners around the world have gotten to know you. And I hope they will hear you in Milan. They will hear you wherever you're conducting. I assume you have a website where they can find what you do. What's the website called?
JamesFeddeck.com.
FEDDECK.com.
ECK. There you go.
So, and I look forward to one day seeing you in person, either in New York, Milan, Cleveland, as they say, or who knows where else. But it's been a pleasure, and I'm going to continue to follow your work.
Thank you,
Thank you
Fred. It's
very much.
been a blast. Thank you.
Ciao.
Ciao.